welcome to Daiwa Foundation's webinar. My name is Nana Ota. So let me introduce today's moderator, Dr. Philip Shetler-Jones. Philip is a senior research fellow at RUSI. He is specializing in international security and geopolitics. Before joining RUSI, he worked for World Economic Forum and Chatham House. And we have a fantastic panelist today, Dr. Wizia from Chatham House, London, Professor Hosoya Yuichi from Keio University, and we have a Pascal Rota, Assistant Professor from Kyoto University. So I would like to hand over to Philip. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana. Welcome, everybody, to this Daiwa Foundation webinar on the impact of the United States elections on the international order. As Nana said, we've got three great speakers, and I think without any further ado, I'd like to get into the discussion. Brief framing point. This 2024 United States election is expected to have significant impacts on the international order. The outcome of the election may have great implications for the war going on in Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, to US policy toward China, and relations between the United States and its traditional allies, both in Europe and in the Asia-Pacific region, including, of course, Japan. So let's begin with this question of order. And so in no particular order, except order of speaking, I'd like to begin with Pascal, if I may. What kind of impact on order do you expect this election to have?
Well, I mean, the difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump is quite large in terms of the way that they see foreign policy. I would expect that if Kamala Harris wins, I wouldn't expect any kind of significant change in terms of how the United States conducts foreign policy. She is the vice president. She was in the, of course, part of the current administration. And honestly speaking, I do think she is quite close to the known democratic and neoliberal, neoconservative policy-making world. So I would expect that things continue as it does under Mr. Biden. But if Donald Trump wins, he has made it quite clear that he believes that he made mistakes in foreign policy in his first administration, and that he wouldn't reappoint somebody like a neocon like Mr. Bolton. He wouldn't try to he would try to wind down the war in Ukraine. He would try to somehow stabilize U.S. foreign policy and also pull back a lot of the engagement, especially in Europe, maybe also in Asia Pacific, although on that one he has been less clear. And in that sense, I would expect under Donald Trump the United States to focus again more on itself and less on its alliance building abroad.
Thank you, Pascal. Just a quick follow-up. Do you think there is a difference in the candidates about how the effect works out in the quality of international order? Is one more destabilizing than the other? And what's that based on?
I would believe that from what I've heard from them, that Kamala Harris is definitely more hawkish, probably, as the current administration is. And I would believe that Donald Trump actually would try to, just in terms of the wars that the United States is involved in, to wind those down. So I might sound counterintuitive, but I do believe Donald Trump would be more of a pro-peace candidate, although not in all theaters.
Well, thanks very much. Yuji, if I may move on with you to the question about how the result of the US election is likely to affect the Indo-Pacific region in particular and US relations with China.
Thank you, Philip. Firstly, let me thank Nana and also Daiwa Foundation to have invited me. I'm really delighted to return to Daiwa Foundation to do this webinar and share some of my thoughts with audience here. Philip, to answer your question, I think if we have a Kamala Harris presidency and Trump presidency, I think the impact for the Indo-Pacific region will be very different. Now, as we know, much of Harris's foreign policy agenda will be a continuation to what Biden administration's foreign policy agenda, that is to building a lattice work of Indo-Pacific alliances to contain China, to contain China's influence within the region. So if we're going to have a Harris administration, and then much box of work will continue, and also the sense of small yard high fence targeted at China's technological prowess will be followed by, will be continue on this. But if we're going to have a Donald Trump, I think he particularly showed his dislike towards allies and towards of America have to pay the security for the Indo-Pacific security architecture. So we're potentially going to see a retreat of the United States within the Indo-Pacific to some extent. I'm not saying they're going to withdraw overnight, but that sense of spending far less in terms of targeted on the military and security cooperation, but will give a much further emphasis towards economic emphasis on the Indo-Pacific. So, for example, I think one of Trump's key advisor on trade and economics, Bob Lighthizer, said quite openly that the 10% tariff will be imposing on every individual country that traded with the United States and 60% towards China. And this would also potentially impact on the prosperity and economic well-being of larger part in the Pacific. So that is one of the elements we have a Trump presidency. Now, secondly, I think much of the foreign affairs emphasis that potential Trump victory will be given to the Middle East. And then hence, much of the resources will be distributed and to make America further get involved in the current Israel-Gaza conflict as being the pro-Israeli core supporters and has been also been core supporter of Republican for Donald Trump himself. So I think that's the level of differences. For in the Pacific region, I think impact will be quite long-lasting and quite different if we have a Harris or if we have a Trump. Now, regarding China, I think the answer is quite clear, irrespective who will be sitting in the White House in the next 4 years. The trajectory towards a China containment strategy won't change by United States, because I think there seems to be the bipartisan consensus that China has been the #1 adversary of the United States. So that sense of pursuit of China containment will continue, irrespective of who will win on the 5th of November. However, I think the differences in here is for Harris, probably we're going to have a sense of low intensity competition, but much of the carry forward and carry on scenario, like what we have with the Biden administration, having the very minimum stability, tiny, just very minimal stability, talk to each other, but on the technology restrictions are still continuing. Whereas if we have a Trump administration, and we're probably going to expecting more roller coaster type of foreign policy being extremely disruptive from the Trump administration towards China, I think either president, it won't resolve the US-China conundrum in here.
Thank you. Well, that sounds a bit like, from the Chinese point of view, the Trump administration would be preferable if, as you put it, he might withdraw somewhat attention from East Asia and focus more on the Middle East. Would that broadly be in China's interest, at least from the point of view of the geopolitical competition?
Well, I'm not saying he would withdraw the military support. I think it also depends on who will advise him, because President Trump is one thing, and his advisor is another thing. So if we have people like Robert O'Brien or Elbridge Colby, and surely I think the support towards Indo-Pacific won't withdraw, but actually strengthened. So it also depends on who will be appointed as the advisor for President Trump in this case. So for China's case, I think China would much prefer to have someone who is more predictable. And someone, on the one hand, you're willing to make a deal, but then on the other hand, the person does not respect the gentleman agreement the two countries that set up back to 1979.
Thank you. Well, that leads us on to Japan, to think about US closest allies in the region. Japan is certainly at the top of that list by most people's reckoning. So let's ask Yuichi, if you could tell us from Japan's perspective, what are people watching in this election? What kind of impact will it have for Japan's security and other interests?
Thank you, Philip. And also, I'd like to repeat my thanks to the Daiwa Foundation for inviting me to this webinar. Of course, Japan is an important ally to the United States in the region, in the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, I also like to say that Japan is now entering into the time of political instability, particularly after the 27th of October last week, because of the Japanese election, general election, snap election, which we had, and the LDP and the coalition actually lost the general election and lost the majority. So now the Japanese government is much weakened with a minority government in it. And in addition to this, we have to realize that we do not have now Shinzo Abe, who could create a very strong partnership with Donald Trump, unlike many Western leaders. So without Shinzo Abe, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, with much weakened political foundation of the current Japanese government, naturally, we should think that the US-Japan alliance or the bilateral relationship will face more challenges or more difficulties in responding to difficult tasks in front of us. This is one thing. Another thing that I like to emphasize on is that I have a feeling that both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump will perhaps further reduce American global leadership role. So whichever wins, it is quite probable that the United States is going to reduce some kind of a heavy burden that the United States currently have in global politics. So this also relates to the current American strategy based upon the integrated deterrence and also the lattice work alliance structure, which is already mentioned. So with these American policies, I think that regional powers such as, of course, Germany, France, the UK, Japan, Korea, and so on, regional powers must have a much heavier burden to play a larger role to create much more stable, predictable international order. So naturally, Japan has more homework to do under the current situation with seemingly a more reduced American global leadership role. But these countries, the UK, France, Japan, and so on, Korea as well, these countries have their own domestic political problems. So it would be more difficult under the current domestic political situation to actually have a heavier burden to play a larger role in global politics. So this is the real problems that we are now facing. And Japan should be included in this category of facing more challenges than before.
Thank you. I wonder if you could give us your brief analysis, looking at the way the Japanese people voted in the election we just had. There are various possibilities what kind of new coalition might form, depending on the position of some of the smaller parties. And can you give us your assessment about whether it's more likely that a coalition will emerge which is more ambitious to play a role in the region, or a little bit more isolationist, or a little bit more modest in terms of what Japan will do to provide not just its own security, but more regional security effects?
Okay, thank you very much. Most of the candidates of recent LDP presidential election, including like Takaichi and also Ishiba as well, and Kobayashi and so on, they all said that Japan should play a larger role in global politics. So whichever won, I think they all have a kind of common sense understanding that under the current international environment, as I mentioned, Japan needs to actually play a larger role in global politics. They all understand that. The problem is not their political leadership. The problem is weakened LDP's power base. It is quite probable that LDP and also coalition partner Komeito will form a minority government. With that minority government, every time I think that the current government will face difficulty in passing bills and the budget as well. So by tackling with those increased difficulties in domestic politics, it is natural to assume that Japanese government under the current Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba will be much less willing or possible to play a larger role in international relations, unlike previous Japanese prime ministers like Kishida or Abe. So as long as the current prime minister or the government cannot solve this difficult problem, I don't assume that the current Japanese government can play an essential role in international politics, unlike previous governments' cabinets.
Thank you. Pascal, if I could come back to you at this stage, because stepping back from the different perceptions from different countries and regions, I know that you're a specialist in the topic of neutrality, and it seems, at least in the European side of the world, neutrality's somewhat going out of fashion. If you look at the enlargement of NATO to include formerly neutral countries like Sweden, is this a trend that you see responding a little bit to the changes in the strength and stability of US global leadership? And if so, where do you see this going? We hear often the theme in Asian politics about we would like not to be forced to choose, which is not exactly neutrality, but it sounds a little bit similar. So what's your view on the future of neutrality under these situations?
Well, I just had a conference that I organized in Kyoto last week, and one of the outcomes is that we kind of agreed, a lot of colleagues, that what we are seeing at the moment is definitely a weakening of neutrality in Europe, but at the same time a strengthening of neutralism or non-alignment or whatever, or third-party balancing, whatever you want to call it, in the larger world. We just had the BRICS Kazan summit, which was huge in Russia, and the interest in BRICS is huge by the global South. And we can clearly see how large and very important actors, especially in Asia, are pivoting toward their own positions, not so much toward the US or toward China, but just toward themselves. India is a wonderful example, part of the BRICS, of course. India has border disputes with China, but they're managing those. They are still collaborating in certain areas, not in others. India is sometimes from the US side regarded as an ally against China, but India doesn't perceive itself as such. India still also trades with Russia. We see that Indonesia and Malaysia and so on, ASEAN in general, is really not happy of being forced to choose, and they're choosing not to. So whether you want to call it neutrality or not is another matter. But this kind of third-party position at the moment is actually strengthening. And this is something that will only be increased by whatever comes out of the United States, because whoever the winner is going to be, it is definitely going to be a problem for the other side. And the chances for like violence in the aftermath of the elections, the chances for like political crises are huge, and whether or not the US will choose to engage more with its traditional allies will not matter that much for the rest of the world that is not the West. So I see this position rather as strengthening, although not in Europe, because Sweden and Finland and a couple of others, they clearly decided that they want to go under the US security umbrella, although Georgia this weekend just voted not to do that, to follow rather a, let's call it, BRICS model of independent development.
Thank you. Yuji, I want to come back to one of the things you mentioned when you talked about the first experience we had of President Trump, which was one where he was quite abrasive to allies, especially on the question of burden sharing and paying their way, and whether or not the relationship offered a good deal for Americans. I'd like to know, because at the same time, it had almost a paradoxical effect in the case of NATO, where NATO got rough treatment rhetorically, but actually the result was they spent more and they committed further to the alliance. I mean, how do you see this kind of paradoxical pattern playing out around China now, because the situation's moved on quite a long way in some areas from where we were with the Trump administration 4 years ago. Especially issues like the Korean Peninsula have evolved quite a lot under the influence of the relationship to Russia following the Ukraine war from 2022. So do you think this kind of abrasive but consolidating effect of Donald Trump's politics offers more opportunities for China, or actually more of a risk that it might lead to a tightening of some of the US alliances around China?
Well, Philip, very tricky question on this one. I think we're now just play with the contradiction in here. So on the one hand, I think the tiny silver lining that with the Trump victory towards Beijing was the sense that perhaps this would offer opportunity for Beijing to mending its much fraught relationship with larger part of Europe. But this also largely depends on how quickly the war in Ukraine will end, and in whatever format this war will end. I think this is also due to the fact that there's only so much resources that United States can be devised, either whether it's in Ukraine or whether it's in Israel, Gaza. So I think it's really have to depend on White House and where do you want to play the emphasis in here. And then that would determine how Trump will act. And that would also determine how the Europeans will respond. But I think so far, judging by the rhetorics, judging by all the talks on different sides, I think countries like, for example, even Ukraine now began to talk to the Chinese on a regular basis. That has already indicated that perhaps the condition of having stopped this war, it might be ready for all parties. And hence that would come into it, the interesting fact that where does NATO play this role? And firstly, whether NATO will allow Ukraine to join as a full member. And secondly, whether there will be the whole notion of Asia NATO. So if the whole notion of Asia NATO come into substantiation, I think that will alert the Chinese even more than anything else. I think that's the first big unknown. Now, the second biggest unknown, I think, is not just how Trump deals with the sufficient resources within NATO, but also how Trump sees the overall Taiwan Strait situation. Because for the moment, I think really judging from the intensity on both sides across the Taiwan Strait, and I think it's fair to say the very dangerous element of military escalation is there. And both United States and China must have some kind of crisis management mechanism to be able to de-escalate the situation rather than just let it into a free fall. But whether Trump is good at that, whether Trump's advisors are willing to have that sense of crisis management across the Taiwan Strait, we're quite unsure for the moment. And surely if you have Harris, yes, that will be something already in the mindset of Biden. And that is also part of the agreement that Biden has with Xi Jinping last year. But really for Trump, I think the biggest unknown here is how is he going to handle the uncertainty across the Taiwan Strait.
Thank you, Jia. Yuichi, coming back to Japan on this, because the potential impact of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait or a war involving the United States and China would be really almost incalculably large for Japan. And despite what you were saying about the effect of the recent Japanese elections and the still unresolved process of working out a new government, even if the result is one where Japan is not really ready to play this bigger role, is it inevitable that Japan will anyway have to respond to this deteriorating security environment, both with respect to increased risk of conflict around Taiwan, but also, as today we saw, the launch of what seems to be the most long-range solid fuel ballistic missile from North Korea, landing in the Sea of Japan. And I'd like you to mention, if you can, also what you see coming Japan's way from the Korean Peninsula, as well as the risk of Taiwan crisis.
Well, thank you very much for your important questions. Of course, Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula. Number one, I'd like to say that, well, whoever is Japanese Prime Minister, I think that the Japanese government will respond to these crises that you mentioned quite effectively, based upon the quite solid current Japanese foreign policy towards the region. Number one, there are three possibilities that Japan and the United States would do in responding to the Taiwan contingency. Number one, both the United States and Japan would do something to strengthen, enhance the security of lane of communications in the area, including Taiwan Strait. And this is what the Japanese and the US government had been mentioning in their foreign ministers' talk and summit meeting as well, because that international strait, that's why it's natural that both Japan and the United States should be responsible to defend the safety of that lane of communication surrounding Taiwan. This is one thing. The second thing that the two countries or Japan would do is to provide some kind of support to Taiwan without military engagement. This is what the United States is now doing in Ukraine, without dispatching troops there. So this is quite probable that both Japan and the United States would do. Now, third option, naturally, would be to do something militarily to defend Taiwan. And this is what we do not know because of the strategy of ambiguity of the United States in the last several decades. And it depends on the situation. It depends on the American administration, what the United States government would do. But I think that in any ways, the current government and many leading scholars in the United States, experts in the United States are mentioning on the importance of enhancing deterrence toward China. Because if something happens, that would be extremely damaging to United States, Taiwan, Japan, or all the surrounding countries, maybe including China. So to prevent this from happening would be the #1 priority. So that's why all these countries, Japan and Taiwan, Korea, and so on, these countries must strengthen a deterrence towards China. And at the same time, of course, it is important for these countries to try to send a good message to China that these countries do not want to escalate the tension in the straits. So in this way, I think that Japan would do quite effectively to maintain or to recover some kind of stability in the region. But I like to emphasize on the importance of North Korea. Because of the closer link between the two countries, North Korea and Russia, North Korea is becoming much more provocative, and the North Korean current relationship with China is becoming much more complicated. This would actually bring some kind of unexpected results in the peninsula. So many experts around this region are now talking about that the North Korean contingency would be more probable in a shorter term than the Taiwan contingency. So we have to watch carefully what China, not China, but what North Korean government is trying to do in the region. And Russia would anyway support those North Korean provocations. So we have to try to, and we cannot stop Russia from doing this. So Chinese law would be important. And of course, we have to watch carefully about what North Korea is trying to do in the region.
Can I come to you, Yujie, on that and get your reaction to how is China viewing this increasingly close cooperation between North Korea and Russia, and what Yuichi said about the perhaps raised potential for some kind of provocative incident that might come out of it?
Well, I very much agree with what Yuichi just said. I think this really give much of nerve, sending nerves to Beijing regarding the recent military cooperation between North Korea and Russia. And the one way to judging from this, I can only judging from public sources. I've compared the congratulation letter on the 75 years anniversary of China-North Korea diplomatic relationship and also the 70 years anniversary. And I found the tones and the language and the wording from Beijing has become much cooler than compared with 5 years ago. So that in a way, I think to some extent, to show the displeasure that Beijing has with this quite irritant neighbor. So, but having said that, I think overall, if North Korea would like to do something within the region, and perhaps Beijing should be the first to be notified. But unfortunately, that's really not the case anymore. I think what we have now is, again, if we're talking about great power collaboration, and this should be really the area that China and the United States need to talk to each other and how to co-manage the pariah state in the Korean Peninsula. So, but overall, I think this big nerve has been centered in Beijing.
Well, everyone will remember probably, it goes back a few years now when we had a six-party talk framework dealing with proliferation issues of North Korean missile and nuclear weapons programs. It seems like a long time ago. Pascal, you want to come in on this and just talk a bit about, what are the prospects for going back to something like a stage where we have a more common vision for solving this among the big powers?
I am actually not that pessimistic about this. Maybe not with all six powers, but one huge difference now compared to a year ago is that we have a hard North Korean Russian security arrangement. The two concluded a treaty, and I looked at the text that the North Korean news agency published. Now, I cannot be sure that that's actually the treaty because we haven't seen that text, but the one that the North Koreans published is quite interesting because it says that either party will consult the other one before it does any kind of military engagement in the region, which to me seems to sound as if though North Korea would not agreed to not do anything in this region without consulting with Russia, and Russia at the moment has zero interest in in escalation on the other side because it already is fighting a war in Ukraine. And secondly, the agreement also actually includes a neutrality clause, which says that if either of the two parties should have military problems with a third party, then either side will remain neutral and not help the third party. With third party, you can only mean China. So both of them are aware that their new relationship might be a problem for China, and that they wouldn't want to, to increase each other's troubles if one of them came into troubles with China. So looking at this gives me a feeling also that North Korea is starting to think more of trying to somehow have a stable neighborhood. Also, they gave up the claim over the whole Korean peninsula. Kim Jong-un said, we know where our southern border is, and we'll leave it at that. And we demand that the South doesn't want to reunite under their leadership. So it seems to me that the North Koreans move rather towards trying to consolidate what is there instead of trying to go after this paradigm of the past of trying to reunify everything under North Korea, which, if true, would make me rather hopeful that we wouldn't see a North Korean contingency in the near or midterm future.
Well, bringing this back, I'll make this my last question before we go to the Q&A, but we remember Donald Trump made actually quite an intense effort to find a new relationship with North Korea, and it didn't come to fruition. But considering now almost the new centrality of North Korea in these relations with China, with Russia, and in the region, how do you each see the prospect of a new President Trump administration having a second attempt, and whether or not that's something that could only be likely with the Trump administration or might need to come from America as an initiative regardless of the result of the election? Could I start with you, Pascal, and then go around on the same order with you, Jie, and then Yuichi?
Well, I mean, looking at how Donald Trump acted before, I mean, first he was extremely belligerent on North Korea and then extremely friendly. and trying to build up on what he already had achieved with Kim Jong-un is something that I would believe that he might want to do. And he would have the power to do so because it's mainly like the charisma of these two people and the grip that they have over media and like just doing this. It takes a small circle of people to actually do that kind of diplomacy. So I would think that probably he would try. At least I don't see why not. Kamala Harris, I don't think that she would change anything from the current course.
Thank you. Yujie?
Yeah, I think this actually give a credit not to Donald Trump, but to Kim Jong-un himself. That is to say, he's able to meet all the three most powerful countries leaders in the world and have some kind of relationship with all of them. This actually gives more credibility to Kim himself and making the Chinese even more nervous on this by getting close, by having the second Trump meeting. So I think the victor in here is the DPRK. It is not United States, it's not China, it's not Russia. So nothing will get resolved. But Kim Jong-un will utilize this opportunity to show that he's someone who actually carries substantive weight within the region for the regional security.
Yeah, it does seem like he has gained a lot of leverage compared to where we were at the end of the last Trump administration. Yuichi, how do you see it?
Yes, I basically feel that North Korea is in a much better situation than 4 years ago under the first Trump administration, because number one, United Nations Security Council, North Korean sanction panel was already dissolved. And Russia has no intention to revitalize those kind of international sanctions upon North Korea. And now North Korea defined itself as a nuclear power equal to the United States, more or less. So under the current situation, I do not find any good solution for the United States to negotiate with North Korea. So maybe if Donald Trump wins, he would be willing to have some kind of a transaction or transactional approach to North Korea, but maybe without any clear strategy or without any clear idea for the solution. But it largely depends on the team. If Donald Trump will have a good team, but of course, there is no more James Mattis, there is no more McMaster, there is no more Randy Schreiber, those kind of quite responsible officials at the core of US administration and the first Donald Trump administration. So, of course, there can be some possibility that like Robert O'Brien or Elbridge Colby will be in the government, but still, I don't know how much they can have an influence upon Donald Trump in his negotiation with North Korea. If this is the case, I think that Donald Trump will go to the negotiation without any clear vision or idea, only for the purpose of doing negotiation without any results. So in this way, I think North Korea would be willing to see that Donald Trump will win the election and Donald Trump and the United States will move forward to go to North Korea to have some negotiation, only for the purpose of maybe bringing better North Korean international image with that transactional negotiation. So I think this would more or less damage the current situation, but even Kamala Harris wins, I don't think that she can create any strong team on North Korea. So if this is a case, whichever wins, North Korea remains a serious, difficult question or problem to the international community.